through some of the basics. Oh, and then how to go for cap in specific instances, and then just give some more like general tips at the end. So feel free just to stop me at any point if I'm going too fast, and I'd also be happy to take questions either at the end or like during the presentation, or you can just email me. So I kind of divided the lecture into 6 main parts. So first, I'll give a quick overview of CAP and its strategic utility. Then I'll talk about specific parts of the CAP-K and then specific AF responses. Then I'll talk more specifically about tips for the CAP good/bad debate and a more specific explanation of how to go for the CAP-K against non-topical KAFs. And then at the end, I'll give some general tips for research construction and going for the K, and I'll also answer questions. And then I've also put in some example cards that I'll be referencing throughout the lecture. So I've just put screenshots in the slides. So they might be hard to see, but I'll just put the link to all of them in the chat. Okay. One sec. Wait, I don't know where the chat went, but oh, here. Okay. Oh wait, the slideshow is kind of small. Is it better now? Oh, okay, well, I guess we can just get started. I put the links to the cards in the chat. Okay, so the first part is like an overview of the CAP-K and defining some basic terms. So first, we have capitalism. A lot of you probably know what it is, but capitalism is an economic system in which private actors own and control property in accord to their own interests, and demand and supply freely set prices in markets in a way that can best serve the interests of society. So the essential feature of capitalism is the profit motive, or the desire for financial gain as an incentive for economic activity. So second, we have neoliberalism. So it's kind of what we use to refer to market-oriented reforms or policies like eliminating price controls, deregulating capital markets, and lowering trade barriers, and reducing, especially through privatization and austerity, state influence in the economy. So this is just functionally like a less regulated version of cap. Next, I wanted to talk more specifically as to why I think the CAP-K is so important and valuable to learn about. So first, it's definitely one of the most versatile K positions in debate. So typically, critiques tend to be either more material oriented, where many people debate it kind of like a counterplan and disad with big stick impacts. So even though Ks are not counterplans and disads, you can kind of just think about it in that way. Or a lot of the times people also go for Ks that are very reliant on framework or like more epistemologically based links with more structural impacts. And that usually means that the majority of the 2R will be spent on debating framework, and they often invest in more exclusive framework interpretations like you link, you lose. But I think one of the reasons why CAP is so helpful is that you can 100% go for it in either way. So you can have like a 2R that almost completely abandons framework and just goes for like CAP causes extinction, like a disad, and alt solves a case and the link's kind of like the counterplan turn the case. Or you can go for a very exclusive structurally or epistemologically based link that's reliant on framework. So I think that having flexibility within the strategy means that AF teams have to be a lot more prepared than they are and spread thin versus other critiques. So this is especially prominent in LD when there's kind of a pretty clear 1AR time skew. And I think you can just put a lot of pressure in the 1AR by making them kind of guess as to what you're going to be going for the K like. Second, I think that the CAP-K is incredibly recyclable across topics. So on basically every topic, you can find a link. So although these links kind of vary in value or quality, I think learning how to go for the CAP-K guarantees that you have a generic ready to go in almost every context. Also, if the links for the neg are really bad, then that probably means that CAP AFs would be really good. So third, I think it's really versatile for a very diverse set of judging. So as personally like a policy debater who primarily just goes for stuff like disads and counterplans, I think most of policy judges, if they're familiar with one critique, it would probably be CAP. And I think you can go for it kind of just very much like a counterplan and disad. And I think also if you are a policy debater and have a more K-leaning judge, then I think CAP is really helpful. Okay, so the next part is like parts of the CAP-K. So first we have the link. So the link is the carded explanation as to why the aff is either entrenched or tied to increasing capitalism. So just a generic tip is that you should adjust link arguments for every 1AC that you debate. So you should have a combo of generic and aff specific cards. So for example, on top of just having like an IP as capitalist card, you should also maybe incorporate a K that's like a critique of China competition or viewing China in a competitive or as a rival for economic or technology related reasons is bad or capitalist. You should also tie each link into a specific component of capitalism being bad. So neoliberalism, imperialism, etc. And then ideally, you need to explain why the link alone turns the case. So you should do analysis as to why strengthening capitalism is net worse for solving every aff impact. So some examples of like generic link premises that people go for is like the aff engages in a state or the government that is tied to capitalism, which is bad. Another one could be like the aff strengthens the power of big businesses to exploit their workers. Another one could be the aff results and increases the exploitation of workers and etc. So I've compiled 2 examples of link cards. So first, this is an example for the IP topic for policy debaters. So this is a link card kind of just for patent affs and IPR more broadly. So it critiques the nature of patents and privatizing knowledge and accumulating capital. And it also critiques the nature of inequality that happens as a result of IPR and patents. So you can make link alone turns the case arguments in this context because you can make arguments as to why it stifles innovation and guarantees that capitalism will always focus on profit rather than societally beneficial innovation, which you can argue is bad for a lot of different reasons. And this is kind of just more of a straightforward link, especially on a topic like IPR, where the link to cap is pretty self-explanatory. But then for LD, if you're following along on the card doc, this is the Osmanova card. So this is just a generic link card for the living wage topic for LDers. So this card is just like a critique of redistribution. So this card argues that redistribution through the capital state or government is bad. So policies like a living wage are bad because it covers up the mechanisms that produce these inequalities to begin with and leaves capitalism unquestioned, even though capitalism is responsible for creating all of these structural harms to exist in the first place. This card also argues that the nature of a living wage and like kind of being a band-aid for the real capitalist problems covers up revolutionary changes and potential for revolutions, which you'd argue is bad. And then you can make a link alone turns the case arguments because legitimizing and covering up the exploitative system of capitalism means the aff will never be able to solve for the root cause of their impacts. So those are just two examples of link cards and ways that you'd explain it in the 2NR and in like 1NC cross-X. So the next part of the Cap K is framework. So this is like definitely one of the most flexible parts of the K. You can kind of adapt it specifically. So I think what the most important part for framework is just thinking specifically about what you think the most threatening aff angle would be against the Cap K. And then you should choose your interpretation for framework based on the 1AR strategies. So these are like 3 main types of framework interps. So first is like you link, you lose, kind of what I was explaining or referencing above. So this is like a super exclusive framework model. So an interpretation could be like, for example, in order to weigh the fiated consequence of the plan, then the aff must defend their epistemological representations and justifications. So your offense for defending this framework interpretation would be reasons why debating or examining epistemology first is good, and why the aff should lose for a violent representation, or letting the aff evade a violent representation is bad. So these types of framework interpretations are very exclusive ones, and they're very helpful if you think that case outweighs or extinction outweighs is the biggest threat or the biggest threat for a 2AR strategy. And this is really helpful because I think winning framework alone is a prior question because it is a question about the model of debate that you are invested in. And it kind of comes prior to whatever the aff's fiated consequences or extinction outweighs offense comes from. So if you're going for a more structural impact to cap or something that's more based on the representations rather than the consequences to the aff, or if your link is not to the plan, then this type of exclusive framework interpretation would definitely help. But this means that most of the time, if you're going for this type of interpretation, it's very like all in on framework, because if you win framework, you win the debate. If you lose framework, you'll probably lose the debate. So these next 2 framework interps are much more like middle ground, so less exclusive. So the first one is political imaginaries or competing political imaginaries. So there's kind of like differing definitions as to what competing political imaginaries is, but kind of the basic premise or the way that I think about it is like they can weigh the affirmative, but you get reciprocal utopian fiat. So for example, the AF gets to fiat a massive change in the government doing a living wage. So this framework argument basically just argues that because the AF gets to fiat such a utopian policy, then we should get equal solvency or equal fiated power for the alternative. So this is good against AFs that want to go for alt-fail strategies, because I think the alt is kind of one of the weaker parts of the CapK, which I'll explain below, but I think it's helpful because it helps you get a little bit out of these like alt-fails arguments or alt is not feasible arguments, and also like preemptively answers a lot of the fairness and clash pivots that the 1AR will make. The next like middle ground interpretation is philosophical competition. So this is just an argument that they should get to weigh the AF and the consequence of the AF so they can weigh the plan, but they just don't get a permutation if you win a link or philosophical like incompatibility. So this is good for AFs that want to go for the permutation, especially this is relevant in the living wage topic where the permutation is pretty threatening and most AFs want to go for like perm do both instead of cap good. You can kind of combine the last two framework interps together and kind of like mesh them together based on the round. But the last two like middle ground strategies, I think are definitely the most strategic in the context of cap, especially if you're going for it with a big stick impact like warming or war, because I think that it resolves most of the 1AR's fairness or clash arguments, because most of these are like premised off the idea that the AF should get to weigh the plan, but under those like bottom two framework interps, they get the plan. So it means that we're not like mooting the 1AC or the typical fairness concerns that people usually have when it comes to fairness. So this means that you kind of have to spend like a lot less time explaining defense to 1AR framework arguments, and you can kind of like allocate time elsewhere, which is helpful because framework is not really the most important part of the CapK, or definitely it's not like utilizing the CapK strengths to the degree that I think is strategic. So the link to the CapK is usually to the plan. So like the last two cards that I shared, those are pretty specific and links to the plan. But if it's not, then you should get ready to answer the 1AR argument called plan focus. So plan focus is a framework argument that the AF should only have to defend itself against the causal and unique consequence of the 1AC. So this brackets out most K arguments because it basically means that every neg position has to functionally be like a counterplan and a disad, but Ks are not counterplans and disads. So under plan focus, Ks don't really exist. So you should answer this in a couple ways. So first, I think if you're making middle ground arguments, you should just use the idea that getting to weigh the case means that it resolves a majority of their offense. And you should just explain a justification as to why you should get links to their justifications and representations. You can win that epistemology is good and helpful, and you should be able to debate about it. Okay, the next part is alternative. So this is the most difficult part of winning the CapK in my opinion. So it's pretty easy to win that capitalism is unsustainable and the AF is capitalist, but you must win the alternative to win the debate unless you just go for it as a framework K, which is like a prior question, but the alt is very important in CapK debates. So I think that winning the alt is difficult for a couple of like issues. So first is feasibility. It seems pretty unlikely that the government will automatically become socialist or there'll be a radical capitalist transition. But then if you fiat the alternative, then you run into a couple of problems because the permutation becomes more compelling for the affirmative, especially perm double bind, which I'll explain below. So you should explain the alt solves a case better than the AF. This should be in the 2NR, and you should change the alternative based on both the link arguments that you read, the impact arguments you read, and the AF that you're debating. So some examples of generic alternatives are kind of the three slots for alternatives that fall under like the CapK. So first is socialism, which is the idea that the resources of society, like land, factories, businesses, should all be owned by the community and not by private individuals. So offshoots or like smaller examples of socialism could be democratic socialism, which is defined as having a socialist economy with a democratic political system of government. So that's kind of just another example. All of these alternatives go in a lot more depth than these kind of blanket categories, but just for the sake of time, I'll just go through like the main categories. So The next alternative is communism. So communism is like an economic ideology that advocates for a classless society in which all property and wealth are communally owned instead of being owned by individuals. So kind of like, I used to have a hard time thinking about this, but like socialism and communism are different because kind of the way in which each of these economic philosophies would be realized in a society. So communism, especially in debate, is often more tied to like a violent revolutionary overthrow of the status quo, where socialism would result from like gradual internal government change. The last alternative is degrowth. So a lot of people read this as a case turn, or like an impact turn on the case, but I think that degrowth is better if it's an alternative to the CAP-K. So degrowth is the idea that we should substantially slow and decrease economic growth, energy consumption, and resource consumption, because that is intrinsically tied to bad things such as warming. Also, it argues that we should be changing our epistemic commitments and mindsets pertaining to capitalist growth and infinite consumption under a capitalist model. So again, like as I mentioned above, each of these go into depth. I would definitely recommend researching each of these if you have time, but this is just kind of a basic overview. So now for like examples of alternatives. So the first example I pulled was degrowth. So this is the Schmelzer card if you're following along on the card doc. So this card argues for degrowth, which is a shift away from capitalism, which this card argues is key to resolving societal and ecological problems. So you can make arguments that the alt solves the case. So I'll just give an example in the living wage context. So you can argue that democratizing economic activities to meet concrete needs like basic living necessity means that the economy is more democratic under an anti-capitalist model. And it also argues that it attaches degrowth to solidarity economics, which means that there'll be less fractional divides and fragmentation among workers. And then also degrowth solves the case because it avoids the exploitation of workers that we argue is intrinsic to the system of capitalism. So that would be kind of more intertwined in the impact debate. And then it also provides uniqueness for impact turns of growth being bad. So the alternative gets rid of growth, meaning that this impact turn now has uniqueness. A lot of the times people struggle winning transition debates on degrowth. So if you read degrowth as a cap alt and you fiat it with like political imaginaries, then that means you get a lot of access to these like decent impact turns. So the next example of the alternative is socialism, which is the Fraser card if you're following along. So this advocates for socialism in like an economic and social way. So we need to disengage and disentangle ourselves from capitalism, but we also need to examine our relationships with capital. So it argues that achieving well-being and happiness can only occur once we separate ourselves from capitalism. And it also provides uniqueness for the impact and link cards of capitalism being bad. So the alternative gets rid of capitalism and the link and impact cards are about capitalism being bad. So now the impact has uniqueness. Next, we're going to be talking about AF responses. So first we have framework. So in most debates, you will need to win that you get to weigh the consequences of the AF against the critique. So this just means that you have to preempt the you link, you lose pivots in the 2 and R. So you should just first always just ask in cross-ex what their framework interpretation is. This can save you a lot of time because if it's something like philosophical competition or middle ground, sometimes it's strategic to concede it in the 1AR because it'll save you a lot of time if you get to weigh the case, which is what the objective of most 1AR framework arguments are. So an exception of like this winning framework, you must win framework like concept is first, in impact turn debates, you usually do not have to win framework because most of the time, the justification for neg framework arguments is capitalism being bad. But if you're winning or impact turning this premise that and winning that capitalism is good, then there's not really a reason as to why framework is good. Also, another reason why you wouldn't really have to win framework is if it's middle ground and you get to weigh the AF. And if you just concede that and want to spend more time on like a link turn, alt fails, cap good strategy, then you can also do that. So example 1AR interpretations are, you've probably seen these at the top of like 1AR docs against the CAP-K, but like interpretation, we get to weigh the AF and its consequences against a competitive and material alternative. Another one is the role of the ballot is to determine the desirability of the plan. And then you should definitely change your framework interpretations, based on the round, and definitely change the amount of time that you're taking to make this argument in the 1AR. The 1AR is a super difficult and time crunch speech. If you know that the framework interp is probably going to be middle ground in the 2NR, you probably don't need to spend more than 10-15 seconds on framework. But if you know that the 2NR really wants to go for framework heavy CapK, then you should obviously be spending more time on framework, because that will probably determine whether or not you win or lose the debate. So common justifications for framework in the 1AR are two things, usually fairness and clash. So you should argue that you should be able to have access to your best offense. So their interpretation, especially if it's you link, you lose, means that it moots 6 minutes of the 1AC. Functionally, everything that you've debated up to this point just goes away. You can also say that debate becomes really difficult and unlimited if the AF is forced to defend things that are not the causal and unique consequences of the AF. So under a plan focus model, you should say plan focus is best for predictable limits for the AF. So for example, like instead of just being held to just debating the consequence of the AF, the neg can now critique or provide or expand the scope of competition to any of the 25,000 words that you've read in the AF, which is obviously not predictable because you don't have defenses for each and every one of those. So kind of just more into depth into how to explain and articulate these impacts. So first, fairness. You should make arguments as to why competition is intrinsically tied to debate. It's the most important impact in debate, and their interp is very exclusionary and moots all of your best offense, which is quite unfair. You should argue that fairness and the value of fairness is empirically proven by the behavior in the round, like technical concessions, wanting to win, etc., all proves that competition and fairness are true. So you should be able, like the side that best proves fairness should win the debate. Second is clash. You can argue that clash turns all their offense and is an external impact because it makes them become better advocates if they're forced to defend the alternative against a logical opportunity cost like the AF. So I kind of put this under framework, but theory can kind of be its own category, but I think in CapK debates it's helpful. So kind of just some examples. First is utopian fiat. So getting to fiat, like a really unlikely, improbable communist revolution, means that it's probably really impossible to garner solvency deficits against alternative if they just fiat through all problems, which is unfair because you have to subject, like the neg can subject the AF to like very rigorous testing about its mechanism and the desirability of it. But if they just get to fiat through all those problems, that doesn't really seem to be fair. Next, there's floating picks. So floating pick is when the alternative results in alternative results in the plan. So if the alternative is socialism, a floating pick would be socialism and a living wage which would be unfair because it gets rid of all the AF's offense and you cannot garner a deficit against alternative if it just does the AF. The next thing is vague alt. So if you're asking them like really specific questions in cross-ex and they're not answering them, then you should just say vague alts are bad, and you can also just use it for a justification as to why you should get new 2-year responses to the alt if they like pivot it from socialism to degrowth, etc. And then the last thing is like international fiat. If they fiat an international socialist transition, that's bad because under this model, it would justify like a world peace counterplan against any like US-China scenario, which would obviously be impossible to garner a solvency deficit against. So those are kind of just generic theory arguments. Usually I don't think that these are drop the debater. So if they don't go for the CapK, you probably shouldn't go for them. But I think it's helpful tools to have. And at best, like these can be made pretty quickly, but the 2NR will be forced to spend A, either a lot of time on it, or B, they concede it. So it just gets rid of solvency for the alternative, which is already difficult to win to begin with. Okay, next we have permutation. So perms are great tools to neutralize all offensive arguments on link arguments, but it also can serve as a helpful tiebreaker. So it also helps skew the 2NR because most perm arguments can be really quick and uncarded. Like perm do both takes 3 seconds to say, but the 2NR has to spend at least like 30 seconds on it, especially on a living wage or like wealth tax topic, considering that the link is not quite as good and is probably resolved by the permutation. So a couple of common 1-year perm arguments. So first is perm do both and perm double bind. I think that this is probably the best strategy that you can go for against cap. So this is just an argument that we should be able to do the alt or socialism and the AF, like a living wage, at the exact same time. So the double bind component of this is either the alt is so strong that it overcomes a link, or it's never enough to solve for the links and the impacts of cap to begin with. So this is incredibly helpful against fiated alternatives. So i.e., if they fiat a communist revolution, then obviously just doing a living wage in one instance wouldn't seem to get rid of all the solvency for the alternative if the alternative already fiats through all these problems like transition wars or transition problems to begin with. The next argument is perm do the aff, then the alt. So I actually don't see this as much as like perm do both, but I think that this can be pretty helpful. So I think this argument is just like we should do the aff first and then the alternative. So the net benefit is usually avoiding like a short-term problem, like a very fast time frame 1AC impact. So if you're winning like a recession happens in like a month, then obviously a recession that causes extinction happens in a month, then obviously doing the alternative and not resolving for that would be bad. So it resolves a majority of the alternative because there's no reason why you have to do the alternative now, but it means that you still get access to aff impacts. Next is like perm do the aff in the mindset of the alt. So this is the argument that like we should do a living wage, but we should adopt a communist mindset while doing so. So this is kind of less helpful against like material links or links to the plan that are like, that's like government redistribution bad, but it can be helpful against more epistemology and like mindset based alt and links. So kind of just keep that in mind. You should definitely be changing the 1AR permutation toolkit that you're choosing for each debate, because like, again, some of these are pretty helpful in some debates and some of them are just not. So you should just save time and not read them. So kind of just like another interesting thing, but like in counterpoint competition debates, a legitimate perm is all of the aff and some and part of the alternative. So you should use this to make creative permutations against a critique. I think if the aff only strengthens a tiny part of capitalism, or there's only like one tiny representation of the aff that's incompatible with the alternative, then you should just say like, do the aff and reject the thing that the neg critiques. Especially if the alt's like a big change like socialism and the link is super small. You need to make arguments as to why this is not severance or a reason why you're like severing out of your justification of the 1AC. But I think these perm arguments are pretty underrated and really helpful. So like if the alternative is socialism and their link argument is like reject the concept of the productive worker, you should just say like perm do the aff and reject the concept of the productive worker. So this is also especially helpful against the links of emissions. So links that are like, you didn't talk about X enough, you didn't talk about like the communist revolution enough. I think these permutations are really helpful against, but also perm do both definitely resolves those. So the next part of aff v cap K is the link turn, or just link debating in general. So a link turn is winning that the aff is good or for either dismantling or resolving some degree of the problems of capitalism. So examples like in the living wage context is like the aff reduces the amount of exploitation for workers because it increases their income so they can meet basic needs like food, housing, etc. And also you can make arguments why using the government as an agent for redistribution or correcting the wrongs of capitalism is good. So these are very helpful in winning the permutation debate or explaining why the aff is compatible to some degree with the alternative. So you can kind of phrase this as a net benefit, like kind of in more counterplanny terms to the permutation. And you should also phrase this as offense against alternative. You've probably read very specific evidence as to why a living wage is the only thing that's able to resolve for inequalities produced. And you should say, if the alternative does not result in a living wage, then it definitely cannot solve the link turn. So it means that the aff is net better for addressing capitalism than the alternative is. I think another subcategory for link turns is like answering the link. So you should definitely answer the link in the 1AR. You should either read carded or make analytical defensive arguments against the link in the 1NC. And also depending on like the type of link that you're making, you could also make the link or explain why the link serves as a link turn. And then I think like just the permutation and link turn kind of go together as a strategy for the 2AR because a permutation resolve a majority of the offense even if the link turn isn't at 100. Okay, so the next part is alt fails. Oops. So you must generate solvency deficits to the alternative in the 1AR. This is incredibly important, or else because the 2AR, you know that they'll want to say that the alternative solves the case. but you have to give reasons that are both AF specific and more generic reasons writ large as to why that is untrue. So definitely the most underrated part of the CAPK is like you need to ask specific questions in cross-ex about the alternative. So neg teams will always be prepared to answer more broad, sweeping claims about what capitalism is, what the alternative would look like, kind of in a broader sense, but you should make them answer very specific questions on things and weaponize those advantages, their answers to your advantage. So for example, if you're reading the farm workers AFs, you should ask them what food production looks like under the alternative. If they say that it rejects industrial agriculture or big companies doing agriculture, then you should just make specific alt-fails arguments about why industrial ag is good, or reasons as to why a world without industrial ag means that it would cause mass food insecurity and trigger every AF impact. Also, if you're reading the healthcare AF, you could ask what healthcare looks like under their model, and then you could read deficits for government-owned healthcare or something like that. And then most of the time, negs are pretty prepared for general alt concerns, but you should just ask specific questions because this is also just a good ethos moment because it just proves reasons why the AF arc is good. So the weakest part of the K is the alt. You must weaponize this to your advantage. So you should frame it like this, they must win the alt. I kind of said that above, but you should say, even if you think that capitalism is terminally unsustainable and the AF is super duper capitalist, that does not matter because in order for the link arguments and the impacts to have uniqueness, all of these are premised on the alternative. So it means that the K just becomes a non-unique disad, so not really a reason to reject the affirmative. So you have to say, or you have to hedge the entire debate on the alternative. And you can kind of just use the fact that the alternative is the weakest part of the CAPK to your advantage because winning it alone takes out the rest of their arguments. So a couple of examples of alt-fails arguments. So first is the alternative is impossible. You can make an argument or read a card that's capitalist mindsets are far too locked in to have a meaningful transition. People will never shift away from their patterns of consumption. So in the context of degrowth, you can make an argument that people will never want to transition away from growth because the model of infinite consumption is just so tied to mindsets. The next thing is the alt causes transition wars. So transitioning to a socialist economy would piss off a lot of allies. It would cause trade networks to collapse. It would cause people to become more militarized and other countries to get mad at the US, etc. And then another argument, there's a lot of cards on this, but the alt causes fascism because if people's mindsets are so ingrained, then it means that the alt would have to be forceful to some degree, which you can make arguments as bad because the 1NC will probably say inequality and capitalist control is bad in some sense, but you can just say that equally exists under a socialist or other transition. And then I think one of the good arguments, and I haven't really seen this argument that much in debate, but the alt cannot solve global transition to things like degrowth, socialism, etc., which they must win to solve their warming impacts. It's global warming, not just United States warming. So you should kind of just debate them on this premise. But you can win that the alternative definitely cannot solve anything, but you can win that hedge good kind of becomes offense. It means that China will continue growing and continue being capitalist and continue contributing to global warming, but you can just say that means that the US is just left behind and hedge is good. And that kind of is just another creative angle against a K. Okay, the next part is cap good and cap bad debates. So I kind of purposely left out the impact explanation for the parts of the K, so I'll just kind of be doing that here. So first, starting with cap bad. So there's a lot of good cards that exist for cap bad, but here are kind of the most common arguments. So first is warming / environmental sustainability. So a lot of people, this is kind of the most common impact card to cap. So cap makes environmental collapse inevitable because it necessitates overconsumption and overextraction of finite resources. So for example, there's a mass amount of overfishing, deforestation, and intensive farming motivated by capital accumulation and the profit motive, which this destroys biodiversity and increases greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to warming. You can also make an argument that it disproportionately harms the environment in the global south, fueling environmental crises and causing the US to kind of just export their problems elsewhere. Next is war. So There's a lot of good arguments on this, like cap causes war because of the inherent competing drives to accumulate more capital and resources through wars with other countries, like trade wars, etc., are all examples of this. The next example is like inequality, which is like accumulating wealth for the elite is contingent on the exploitation and mistreatment of workers and the working class. So like kind of in the context of the living wage topic, this would be more of like an impact to the link, but I think like you could also make inequality not only just a structural, but also like a pretty like big stick impact. Like there's a Schmidt and Jugin like institutional capacity card that a lot of people read on the aff that you could read on the neg as an impact to cap. And then I think like just the main thing is just go for one specific impact in the 2 and R. You should go for an impact that you think best interacts with the aff impacts, like best impacts that turn the case, etc. But there's also like a lot of more cap bad offenses like soil erosion disease, etc. But I just don't have time to go through all of those. But these cards definitely exist and these cards are good. Okay, the next thing is cap good, so the opposite side. So there's equally a lot of good and new cards for cap good. So I'll kind of just go through each like component of impact on the other side. So first is like the warming and environmental sustainability stuff. So you can make arguments as to why green technologies like carbon capture, electric vehicles, and clean energy are all intrinsic to capitalism and require capitalism / the profit motive to develop. So these technologies are sufficient to alleviate some or all of the impacts to warming, even if they were initially caused by capitalism. So an important word that you probably heard in a lot of these Cap K debates is decoupling, which is the idea of severing growth and emissions. So this answers the Cap bad argument that like warming is intrinsically tied to growth or there's like a one-to-one relationship. But if you're winning that countries can decrease emissions while increasing growth at the same time, then that probably takes out a lot of these like root cause arguments. Next is war. So there's cards that say that the interdependence of countries because of things like trade that are intrinsic to capitalism means that countries are less likely to engage in war because they want to resolve conflicts peacefully, and it would be illogical and bad for them to resolve it in a violent way. Next is like space call. So this is kind of more of like a cap good argument. A lot of people on the negative would just impact turn it, but there's like one specific card that says this, but like capitalism is key to space exploration, which solves existential risks. Even if they're winning that capitalism will kill us all on the earth because of warming, space call will help us get out of it. Just in cap good debates in general, time frame is definitely your best weapon. So usually the 2R will go for warming, but warming is decades off, or maybe like it's a longer time frame than what the aff impacts would be. But you should win that a transition to capitalism caused extinction before the aff / capitalism caused extinction via warming, and before the alternative can resolve for the sustainability impact. So that kind of just makes for a very clear aff ballot because you can only die once. Yeah. And then I think you should also entangle the alt fails debates into cap good debates. So this makes the neg makes them defend their greatest strength, which is probably like the sustainability / link debate, with their greatest weakness or the alternative. So hedge good becomes a reason why cap is good, or transition wars becomes a reason why cap is good, or why there's no uniqueness for being able to solve for the unsustainability debate. Next, I pulled some examples. So you probably want to open the card doc because this card will be hard to see. But this is the Siddiqui card. So this is cap bad for warming. So it says that capitalism is intrinsically tied and the root cause of the destruction of the environment and biodiversity. It also makes a claim about war. It says that capitalism causes imperialist wars, and it also is pretty helpful to have in the 1 and C because it answers a lot of the 1AR pivots that they'll make about cap good, because it indicts things like green tech, things like CCS or like / carbon capture, and that the other side will make arguments about. So instead of just having to read a whole nother card in the 2R, which takes a long time, then you can just like cross apply these warrants and have that like embedded clash already in there. So an example for cap good is Rosencrantz. So this says that capitalism can become sustainable, and the adoption of green tech like renewables, recycling, and reduced consumption are all happening under capitalism and sufficient to recorrect for past harm. So even if they're winning that capitalism may have been unsustainable in the past, we've read evidence that we're past the tipping point, so the only way to mitigate warming to a considerable degree is through renewable energy transition and clean energy. Okay, generic tips for cap good/bad debates. First is evidence comparison. So this definitely matters a lot. This is the most important thing when it comes to these types of debates. So you need to implicate specifically why the warrants in your cards are better than the other sides. So you need to explain why green tech resolves some of the environmental sustainability claims that the aff will make. So you need to explain why recency matters in these debates, about the efficacy, like for example, of green tech. I think like a lot of people tend to use like really old stuff for cap good and bad debates, but you should kind of weaponize that to your advantage, especially in like the warming/sustainability debate, where I think that new studies, time frame, green tech, etc., that makes time like recency a lot more relevant. Next is impact calculus. So time frame is the biggest aff tool. So the next needs to be reactive and preempt these time frame arguments that the 2AR should make in the that the 2AR is going to make. And then you kind of just need to uplayer their offense and make comparative weighing arguments, because if one side's going for war and one side's going for warming, then it can become difficult to resolve for the judge, and it makes the debate a lot more into a coin flip than what you'd want it to be. Next is that you should diversify your impact cards every now and then. So aff and neg teams are both pretty prepared to have the climate change debate. Like I think a majority of the cap good research or back files that exist are on this question, but like aff and neg teams both might be a little less prepared for like AI super weapons, industrial ag, soil erosion, disease debates. So you should just try and like catch them off guard every now and then. It just makes for a more interesting strategy. And then you should definitely read cap good against cap affs. I think that this is super underrated because like 1ARs get really time crunch and time skewed, so you can definitely spread them out in the 1NC. Like if you're able to read like 20 or 30 cards in the 1NC, then there's no way that 1AR can get back from that with 4 minutes, especially if you read another position. And because it's on case, it means that they have to answer it first. So they'll probably like undercover like a topic specific disad if the aff is topical and stuff like that, or they'll undercover framework. So it kind of just gives you like a time skew advantage, especially in LD. Okay, so next part is cap gay versus non-T affs. So I'm kind of just going to give a brief overview, but you should know that this goes into a lot more depth, but this would probably take like another hour to explain. But here are just some starting basics. So some common link arguments is first the premise of individuality or the individual approach to movements. So this is incompatible to the alt's idea of party politics because it breeds competition among the other proletariat. I probably should have defined this before, but the proletariat is the working class. But this fractures movements for social change because it makes it impossible to overthrow the elite if everything is very fragmented and people are not working together and instead are just working in very individual ways. So against like specific identity politics affs that make the debate very centered on individual experiences, this is a link argument that you could read. The next link is the infrapolitics link. So this is the idea that reading the aff or winning the ballot in one specific round is the necessary and sufficient condition to solve for all aff offense. So understanding like small cosmetic changes as sufficient depoliticizes resistance to actual problems, which is bad. Like obviously winning one ballot is not going to materially change a lot of things, and we make arguments as to why, we make link arguments as to why viewing it that way is bad. The next link is material action. So it's just the idea that learning about something is not a substitute for material action. So this type of thinking that, I just learned about something, so I don't have to engage in this problem anymore is bad because it waters down the real types of movements that must happen via material change, which are necessary to overcome violent, materially based systems. So this is helpful against affs that make arguments about and have material impacts, but their method is solely mindset or epistemically based. So this is kind of when this link argument applies. Kind of strengths is that you can make alt-solved case arguments. You should read a theory of power or impact explanation as to why the capitalism is the root cause of the problems described in the 1AC. And then like you should make link alone turns case arguments, explain why labor commodification, elite backlash, fragmentation, etc. are all reasons or DAs to AF solvency, which they cannot overcome, but the alternative can. Kind of on an impact level, you should go for very specific internal link turns case arguments, but you can also read warming, inequality, any of the cap bad impacts that we discussed above, and just contextualize them as to why those turn the case. Okay, the example for this is the Gurevich card. So this critiques the lack of concrete demands. It argues that a change is both possible and necessary, but like material change is possible and necessary, but it requires a degree of organizing and concrete material-based movements. So this card I would kind of read against like pessimism of affirmatives or affirmatives that just defend like an epistemic shift rather than a material mindset, or kind of the thing I discussed above, like the mismatch between a material impact and like a really epistemic-based method. Okay, so lastly, I have some general tips / advice. So first is like definitely use past cards and recut cards to get a better understanding of the components of CAP. So this link right here is to OpenEV. So OpenEV is definitely like one of the best tools for mining and finding cards. So a lot of the policy camps this summer, like DDI, Michigan 7 Week, etc., produce a lot of CAP files because it's like a big generic on the IP topic. So even if it's a little different than the LD topic, there's still a lot of updates for cap good and bad debates and a lot of new cards. So you can kind of look through there. There's also a lot of like diversity for impacts that you can read. So kind of the thing that I talked about above about like throwing off people by not just reading warming. You could take some of these cards. Even though it's tempting to steal cards, I think recutting them is so much better for comprehension. And then you kind of like, it kind of just gets ingrained into your understanding of it. So you get better at explaining for it and going for it without having to like pre-write the entire 2NR or 2AR. I think also this just applies to debate writ large, but always read more. It doesn't always have to be about the topic, but getting a more nuanced understanding of what capitalism is super helpful. Also, you should always make sure that you're adapting and changing your cap strategies based on different AFs. So no two cap K2NRs or 1ARs should ever be the same. They should always differ to some degree. So you should know or think beforehand as to how you want to go for the cap K in that round, because of like when I see strategy, judging, or like etc. And you should have a reason as to why you chose to go for cap in that way. So that's the neg side of stuff. On the AF side of stuff, you should be thinking about what your ideal 2AR in that debate will be. You should think about the specific affirmative that you read. Like if you read a growth good AF, then probably doesn't make that much sense to go for a link turn. Or if you read like a hedge good AF, maybe it makes a little less sense to go for a link turn. So if you know that if like the 2 ARs want to be cap good, then that should just be the way that you're investing your time. And then next thing is that, well, I kind of like, just like one more thing, I kind of explained throughout the lecture as to how you could differ or change things up on both the AF and the neg. So you should kind of just be thinking about that throughout your like strategic considerations. The last part of this is like, you should definitely use cross-X. You need to identify the weakest part of the K, and then you should just press them on that for 3 minutes. So it makes them take specific positions on the K, so you can generate new offense on that. Or if they don't know what they're talking about or don't want to like specify, gives you vague alts and theory arguments. Or it's just like a good ethos moment because it proves that you have perceptual dominance, you know what you're talking about, and they don't, which is just good for like speaker points, general ethos, etc. And then I think like just identifying the weakest part of the K is helpful because you know that like negs want to talk all about their link arguments and all about the impact and sustainability debate. But if you're forcing them to answer specific questions on their weakest part, then that kind of just gives a judge a better sense of like what your strategy is going to be. And you can use cross-X as a speech to explain the arguments or preemptively set up the arguments that you want to make in later rebuttal speeches. Okay, those are all the slides I have. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Okay, so the question was, how do you know what alternatives to read? So here, let me go back to the alt slide. So you should kind of just think about what type of alternative you want depending on what the impacts are and what the link arguments are. So I think like it kind of depends on like what you like explaining. So I personally read either like degrowth or democratic socialism just because I feel comfortable about explaining them. I think, but like you can explain them and like I think you should kind of just choose based on the AF that was read. I think that like you kind of also just want to make sure that your link and alt match up, because if your alternative is just like if your alternative is like solely epistemic but the link you've read is like material to the AF, then you should also be reading a material alt. So you should kind of just be thinking about what link arguments am I reading and what alternative would go best with that. And then 2, think about, so the alternative provides uniqueness for the link and impacts. So depending on what impacts you want to read, you should adjust alternative based on that. Like, for example, on the IP topic, there's like this knowledge socialism. We should get rid of IP and open source patents and innovation. That wouldn't match super well with generic like growth bad arguments because that alternative does not reject growth. So in that case, you would just have to be thinking specifically as to what impacts you want to read and what impacts you want to read and how like the alternative would resolve some of those. And then I think another consideration is like if the alternative is super big and the link is super small, that means that the perm is probably more compelling for the affirmative because the alt is a bigger change. And if the link is so small, it probably wouldn't overcome it. Does that make sense, or do you have like a more specific question? Does anyone have, oh, okay. Okay, the question was, I see a lot of CapKs that have dual power organizing and the Black Panther. What does that mean? So that's just like another example of an alternative. A lot of people like the dual power organizing card is like the Escalante card, which is pretty popular in debate. So I think that like the dual power organizing is just a way, like a more revolutionary alternative, and just gives examples as to why or how the revolution would materialize. I'm not super specific, like familiar with alt because I don't really go for it or read it. But I think if you like look at the warrants in the card, it's like more specific to like a more revolutionary strategy. And then the Black Panther Party, I think that's more of like, that's like a past example of organizing and like revolutionary change. So that would be more of like a revolutionary alt rather than like a government shift to like degrowth or socialism. But again, I'm not as familiar with those alternatives. But definitely like I would recommend like reading through the cards or reading through the alternatives or reading through the cards and the articles to see more specific warrants. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay. Like if you don't think of questions now, you can always just email me after. Here, I can just put my email in the chat. And I'd be happy to answer like more specific questions if they come up, or if you have, like I tried to make the slides pretty like paragraph and word heavy so you could refer back to them. But yeah. Thank you for coming.
Olivia, can you also put this link to the slides in the chat?
Oh yeah, of course. Sorry, wait, I lost my, okay. Okay, perfect. I just put them in the, I just put the slides in the chat.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for doing this topic lecture, and thank you to like the people. Why do I keep saying topic lecture? This CapK lecture, and thank you to the people who came. I'm gonna post the meeting recording on YouTube tonight, so it should be up if anybody wants to watch it. But that is all. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.